Continuing with the book by Gregory Brandt, a wonderful book by Gregory Brandt called Homeless College Student. This is chapter 2, 72 Chevy. It was early spring and hot and humid when I got out of jail. I had a clean mind and body and had never been so optimistic about the future. I was off probation and I hadn't smoked, drank, or had a single piece of candy in 4 months. I was so upbeat you'd think I was giving a self-help seminar. Michael took the bus to the downtown jail and waited across the street for me to get out. He greeted me with a handshake and cigarette. He said he'd spoken to Mom and Guy and they said I could sleep on their couch. I told him I appreciated the offer, but I wasn't interested. Getting out of jail was a riveting experience and I felt like I could take over the world. I planned on joining the military and the last thing I wanted to do was sleep on Mom's filthy couch. Michael and I caught a bus to Mom's house and waited in our living room for her to get home from work. When she opened the door, she dropped her groceries and gave me a big hug. She had a tear in her eye as she looked me up and down, making sure I was the same person and hadn't broken any bones. I told her I felt great and promised I'd never go back to jail again. I tried telling her about my plans to join the military, but she was just happy I was alive. Later that evening, Benny, Jonathan, and Janet came over and I entertained everyone with amusing stories about my time incarcerated. My first night out of jail, I slept in a tent in Mom's backyard, but it wasn't long before Michael convinced me to come inside. Their house was packed to the ceiling with boxes of useless crap that Guy had tried to sell at the flea market every weekend. The only space available was on the tattered sofa, which smelled like dirty socks and corn chips. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sounds of the Price is Right game show, and it didn't take long to realize how uneventful life can sometimes be. By the end of the week, I'd smoked enough weed to realize that joining the military wasn't for me. Sitting on a rooftop counting falling stars, I came to the conclusion that I was going to call my own shots, be my own hero, and fight battles I actually believe in. Neither me nor Michael are violent toward anyone besides each other, and the last thing either of us would want to do would be to hurt someone for no reason. After a month of living on Mom's couch, I got a call from one of our sisters in Austin. She heard I got out of jail and invited me to stay with her in the expensive duplex our father bought her. She was finishing her last semester of an advertising degree at UT and had an extra bedroom. I jumped at the chance to get out of San Antonio. I would have moved to Austin months earlier, but I had that bitch of a probation lagging over my head. Michael and I had been there a few times, and it always seemed like a faraway location where everything was fresh and more exciting than anything in San Antonio. We'd never even been to a coffee shop before we visited one in Austin. Before I ever set foot in Austin, I always pictured myself living there and going to school at UT. When you grow up in Texas, one of the first decisions young people make is whether they're an Aggie or a Longhorn. Most kids at our school sided with the Longhorns, but there were a few rebellious kids that would go the other way and wear Aggie garb. I took a few years before making up my mind. There were so many Aggie jokes going around Texas that I wondered why anyone would want to associate with them. I thought there must be some mystical reason why they joined the sparsely populated Aggie camp instead of the vast Longhorn Brigade. I found the Aggie mysticism appealing, but after I compared the school's different hand signals, I decided that University of Texas had to be the superior institution. This was my first summer in Austin. My sister was busy with schoolwork and an internship, and she was hardly ever home, so this meant that I had the place to myself. I took advantage of the situation and invited all types of characters to the duplex when she wasn't home. Every day, I'd hang out on the street adjacent to UT known as the Drag. One of my first days in Austin, there was a parade for Heisman Trophy winner Ricky Williams. I felt a sense of community in Austin unlike anything I ever experienced on the north side of San Antonio. I savored my days and did things I couldn't back home, like hanging out in coffee shops, arcades, and bookstores in the most urban neighborhood I'd ever been in. I met a smorgasbord of people associated with UT and spent hours writing poetry, flirting with girls, and playing the wide variety of cheap arcade games against a local group of homeless kids known affectionately to people of Austin as drag rats. When I wanted a moment to myself, I'd slip into the Dobie Mall food court and stare out the second-story window, daydreaming. Dobie Mall is a pseudo-mall located a few yards off campus. It's one of the largest private dorms in the U.S. and at one time was the tallest building in town. Michael Dell used to sell computers out of his room on the 27th floor, and director Wes Anderson made minimum wage selling movie tickets in Dobie Theater. Dobie Mall doesn't have any clothing stores and lacks most things associated with your typical mall atmosphere. The first 2 floors were open to the public and included a food court, a cheap movie theater, a video game arcade, and a military recruiting station. There were a few other small shops, but nothing like the chain stores you'd find in a regular mall. That summer in Austin was the first time since I lived in Jonathan's garage that I had somewhere to come home to. I didn't need much money, just enough for coffee, a little pot, and a few quarters for the arcade. I was as content as a young person could be. By the end of the summer, I couldn't believe how many people I'd met and the adventures I had. This kind of stuff didn't happen in San Antonio, and I'd never felt so free and creative. Knowing that my sister wasn't going to kick me out, despite me bringing home the occasional drag rat, gave me peace of mind. I could relax, work on my writing, and enjoy being alive. Toward the end of the summer, I bumped into a former co-worker from my days selling newspaper subscriptions in San Antonio. We ran into each other one night at a 7-Eleven gas station. I was surprised to see someone I knew from my newspaper days. Austin felt so far from my hometown, and selling newspapers was the last thing on my mind. My old colleague from the San Antonio Express-News excitingly told me that he and a few chosen members of the San Antonio sales crew had been contacted for a one-time only newspaper sales gig at the University of Texas. The job involved selling the Austin American-Statesman paper to newly arriving college students and was going to happen on the drag. They called it the College Campaign. The meeting was serendipitous, set up by a higher power. The Statesman was looking for all the top newspaper salesmen in San Antonio and planned to organize them together so they could move them to Austin, set them up, and have them sell their paper instead. They couldn't find me in San Antonio because I was already in Austin. The campaign was an all-out newspaper sales assault on the horde of unsuspecting college students during the first week of classes at UT. Newspaper crews from Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio gathered in Austin to slang their respective papers to the thousands of new and returning students. These kids came from all parts of the state and moved to Austin the same week. I was a long way from being a University of Texas student, but I was still right in the middle of the action. The first week of classes at UT is an exciting time for everyone, including anyone out to make a buck. There were pitchmen from all over Texas gathered in Austin selling credit cards, magazine subscriptions, and every major newspaper in the state. My crew began setting up booths on campus a week before classes officially started. Anyone and everyone who walked by would be another chump to lay your sales pitch, snag a smile, get them to get out their parents' credit card, and start filling out your form. It was hard work, but all the kids in the crew made more money than we ever had before. We'd stand behind folding tables at different spots on campus selling subscriptions to students walking in between classes. Sometime in the early evening, when classes ended for the day, we'd pack up our tables, papers, and t-shirts and start knocking on doors selling subscriptions in all the trendy college neighborhoods around UT. Even though all of Texas's major newspapers were there, nobody made as much money as the Austin American-Statesman. Most students moving to Austin wanted to forget about their lives back home in Houston, Dallas, or whatever small Texas town they were from. Students, staff, and faculty were much more interested in getting a local paper rather than one that's printed more than 100 miles away. None of the newspaper kids from San Antonio had stable families or were going to school regularly, so the move 60 miles north wasn't very traumatic for any of the delinquents. I was already in Austin, one step ahead of fate and my former newspaper cohorts. Sometimes things work out like they're supposed to. You try to do everything you can to get off course, and you wind up exactly where God intended. It was the best 2-week gig I ever had. It gave me a chance to establish a relationship with UT and learn about the brilliant people there. I knew in my heart that whatever happened to me in coming years, this campus and the neighborhood surrounding it was going to be a big part of it. Whether I turned into a drag rat or a well-dressed journalism student, I knew that this was the setting to whatever story my life was going to tell. The workday started early. Our boss would pick us up at each of our houses, and then we'd go eat breakfast before heading to campus. Then we'd set up our tables and start selling newspaper subscriptions. Most of the day, we bought beyond our own with just a folding table, some free t-shirts, and a couple hundred copies of that day's paper. It was all that was needed to make almost $2,000 and talk to more gorgeous women in those 2 weeks than I had previously combined in my entire life. I would have been starting my freshman year of college if I'd taken the road most traveled, on the same city block, on that same exact day, under the same sky, but dealing with totally different circumstances. If I would have graduated high school, made good grades, and did everything I told I was supposed to do, I still would have wanted to go to UT, and I still would have found myself on the same street at that same time. I was where God intended me to be. It didn't matter that I wasn't an official student. I still felt accepted, and everyone I met was another story. During this time, people socialized in coffee shops, played video games in arcades, and waited in line for payphones. They weren't as uptight and into themselves like they are today. Nobody cared about the internet or had a cell phone. People were more open and friendly to strangers. That's how you met people, not on social media. I lost count how many friends I made that summer at La Fun Arcade, Quack's Coffee Shop, and on the big comfy chairs in Barnes & Noble. Work was easy. Most guys would just wait for someone to walk by and yell, "Free paper," Once they took the paper out of your hand, you gave them a flyer that brightly listed the student specials. After they had the flyer in their hand, you give them your pitch. If you got that far, hardly anyone said no. No one wanted to look cheap or poor on the first day of school, and most kids had plenty of disposable income. If they didn't bite on the free paper spiel, you could always bribe them with a t-shirt or koozie. There were kids everywhere, so you could just throw a koozie in the air, wait for someone to catch it, and then give them your sales pitch when they brought it back to your table. A few of the more shady salesmen went as far to telling kids that the professors had required to get the paper delivered. That week was a turning point in my life. God was telling me something chief. I ran into kids I knew from growing up in the upper middle class neighborhoods of San Antonio. They were surprised to see me on UT's campus. Some had heard I dropped out of high school and landed in jail, but I was an 18-year-old kid away from my hometown for the first time, just like they were. The campaign lasted for 2 weeks before everyone packed up and headed home. The newspaper boss wanted me to continue working in Austin, going door to door, but I wanted to take the money I made and go back to San Antonio to buy a cheap car with Michael. It was the first time either of us ever had enough money for a vehicle. The next day, I took a Greyhound to San Antonio. Michael and I decided to buy the first car we saw under $1,000, figuring anything with an engine and 4 wheels would be sufficient. A few blocks past the Planet K smoke shop on Austin Highway, we spotted something in my price range, a 1972 neon orange Chevy longbed pickup truck. The guy selling it was an old drunk named Duke. He wore overalls, lived in a trailer, and reeked of moonshine. I should have known better. Duke said he was going out of town on business as soon as he sold the truck. He was asking $1,000. I offered him $900, and before I could even finish counting it, he snatched it out of my hand and put it in his pocket. The truck ran for 3 days. I took it to Benny's and let each of my friends take a turn driving the neon orange beast while we tripped acid. I couldn't wait to get back to Austin and show it off around campus. Looking back, I probably should have been in more of a hurry. I had a good thing going in my sister's duplex, and I should have protected it. Back then, I didn't know anything about cars, and I didn't once think about checking the oil or water. I figured that as long as you put gas in something, it'd move. There are 2 ways to learn in life. You're either taught something by someone as a way to save you some grief, or you go out and learn it on your own, the hard way. I knew I had to get back to Austin, but the drive from San Antonio was daunting. I'd never driven on the highway before and didn't even really know how to drive to begin with. But I had to get back if I wanted to keep living at my sister's duplex and hanging out on the drag every day. I took a few deep breaths and told myself that I'd be okay as long as I drove real slow and stayed in the right lane. The part of the highway that scared me the most was a section going through New Braunfels. It had been under construction for years. The worst part about it was that there wasn't a shoulder or access road to pull over to if you had engine trouble. I'd taken this route as a passenger many times and always wondered how motorists dodged getting hit if their car happened to stop moving on that stretch. The image plagued my brain, so I figured to be as cautious as possible, I'd leave during the early morning hours where there was the least amount of traffic. I dropped Michael off at Mom's and got on I-35. The truck was doing okay for the first 20 miles. I had the radio blasting the San Antonio oldies station and cruise, but as soon as I got to the shoulderless stretch and the radio reception wore off, I noticed the engine getting louder. I kept the static on the radio blasting because it blocked out the truck noise and helped calm my nerves, kind of like a baby falling asleep to a vacuum. When I got to the stretch of freeway going through New Braunfels, I noticed the lanes were getting narrower and the concrete barrier approached me on both sides. There was no longer a shoulder to pull over to if I had engine trouble. The noise level of my truck started to increase and my heart rate quickly followed. It was the kind of buildup you hear before something is about to go boom. I tried to stay positive and convince myself it was all in my head. I turned up the static and told myself, it's an old truck and old trucks are supposed to be loud. Plumes of smoke started billowing from the hood and my visibility decreased rapidly, but I stayed calm and played it off the same way I did with the engine noise. It's an old truck, and sometimes old trucks get a little smoky. Soon the smoke got so thick I couldn't see anything, and the truck got so loud it was like an electric drill on meth. I wanted to pull over, but there wasn't a shoulder, so I kept pushing it despite the noise and smoke. I pressed on the gas pedal and tried to get through the shoulderless stretch as quickly as possible, pushing the old bloke harder than it had gone since the Nixon administration. I had the pedal to the floor but wasn't picking up any speed, and the engine was screaming bloody murder. Then, a gigantic bang ripped the electric wire holding the hood in place and sent it flying into the Texas night. I lost control of the vehicle and dangerously swerved in between 2 lanes before grasping the wheel as tight as I could, trying not to flip over. I finally got into the far right lane, but my truck was still barreling forward, crunching against the concrete barrier on the passenger side and shooting sparks like the 4th of July. When it finally screeched to a stop, I caught my breath and looked around. I was blocking one of only 2 lanes on the busiest highway in Texas. I sat there for a few seconds and watched cars drive by. They all honked, but I didn't know what to do, so I turned off my lights thinking it might be blinding them. Less than a minute later, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw a huge semi-truck coming from behind. It didn't look like he was going to stop, but I heard his brakes kick in about 100 yards away. It was at this moment I realized how vulnerable I was, sitting in a parked car on the freeway with my lights off. The concrete barrier was blocking the passenger door from opening, so I rolled down the window and squeezed out and onto the construction cement. Jumping off the barrier, I ran across the highway to the next gas station and told the clerk what happened. He said the police were on their way and I need not worry. Hearing the police were on their way did indeed cause me to worry. For starters, I didn't have insurance or a driver's license. This wouldn't have been so bad, but I also had a prison stint worth of acid on me. 5 minutes later, a squad car pulled into the gas station. I stood in front of it waiting for the cop to get out. When he finally did, he looked me up and down and sarcastically said, "Heard you had engine trouble." I had a story prepped in my head even before the first sign of trouble and told the cop, I was a University of Texas student that had been in San Antonio over the weekend buying a car with my brother. I told him I had class in a few hours and had to get back to Austin right away. He gave me a suspicious look before asking what my major was. I already had this invention down pat and calmly said, "Journalism." The cop didn't ask me for my license or insurance because he was too amused about the fact that I bought a piece of shit truck for $1,000 that broke in 3 days. I was glad this boob found my misfortune funny because it distracted him from noticing the large surplus of illegal drugs. I also put on a big acting job, pretending I had a terrible case of buyer's remorse and even managed to provoke a lecture about being cautious when buying used vehicles from the moron. A few minutes later, a tow truck pulled up with my scrapped-up Chevy on its back. I jumped inside as fast as I could and thank God I wasn't in jail. I didn't have any money, but I told the driver to take me to San Antonio. Austin was 40 miles away and San Antonio was 20. It would have cost more to have me and my truck towed to my sister's house, and she most likely wouldn't have lent me the money to pay the driver. My only chance was to have my busted vehicle towed to Mom's and hope that Michael could lend me some cash. When we got there, I saw Michael's bedroom light on. He was up late working on his artwork. I told the truck driver that I'd be right back and ran up and knocked on his window. The driver must have thought this was odd because he got out of his vehicle and joined me. Michael saw me with the burly driver and didn't hesitate to lend me the money. I paid the guy and he dropped my truck and drove away. Michael turned his light off and went to sleep. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my busted truck feeling sorry for myself. Feeling sorry for yourself is just about the most unproductive thing you can do. My ego refused to let me go back to Austin without my '72 Chevy. If I took a bus, I would have had to consider my trip a failure. I would have gone to San Antonio on Friday with enough money for a car and gotten back to Austin on Monday with no car and no money. For the next few months, I moped around San Antonio and didn't do much besides stay up until the sun came up, smoking pot and playing guitar with Benny. I wasn't welcome inside Mom's house, so if Benny was off doing something with someone else on any particular night, I'd usually sleep in Mom's backyard with her smelly dog, Elmo. After my truck broke, Michael was more motivated than ever to scrounge up enough cash for a down payment on a used vehicle. Willing to do anything, he signed up to be a guinea pig in a research study in Austin. He was there for over a month. He got out, cast his check, and went straight to the Ugly Duckling car dealership where he scored a used Geo Prism with over 100,000 miles on it. One of the first things we did was take a road trip to Las Vegas the day after Christmas. I just read Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and we tried to make our own exploit as similar to the one in the book. It was an epic adventure with illegal gambling, acid tripping, and a once-in-a-lifetime million-person celebration when the clock struck midnight. When we got back, I got a call from our sister in Austin. She said the newspaper crew had been looking for me and wanted me to work the college campaign again. I could stay at her duplex during the gig, but I had to find somewhere else to live and another job as soon as it ended. This was the news I was waiting for. I couldn't wait to get back to Austin and UT. It was the only thing I've been thinking about since I left. I kept my broken truck parked in front of Mom's house and hopped a bus to Travis County. My original goal was to make at least $1,000 for a new engine, but plans changed when I got back to Austin and didn't feel like leaving. I made almost as much money selling papers that spring that I did the previous fall, but instead of using it to go back to San Antonio and fix my truck, I decided to stay in Austin and rent a cheap room. Right before the campaign ended, I moved in with a deaf guy near campus named Peter. Our first phone conversation through a hearing-impaired translator went well. I never had one of those conversations before, and I got a kick out of having the mediator repeat things I said about weed. Peter told me he was 420 friendly, had the best buds in town, and smoked religiously. It sounded like a cool place to live with some interesting people to write about. Over the phone, Peter seemed like a friendly pot-smoking handicapped person, but it wouldn't take long to learn he was a pill-popping asshole. Peter was completely deaf, but he hadn't been that way his whole life. He got into a severe car accident in his 20s when he was shit drunk, pulling down the wrong way on a busy street and smashing into a vehicle driven by a family that never knew what hit them. The college campaign ended shortly after I moved in with Peter, and I found a job as a dishwasher working a few blocks from campus at the Madison dormitory. I couldn't have asked God for more. I had a full-time job right in West Campus, and I could hang around UT before work, after work, and during my 1-hour lunch break. All the dorm's co-ed residents were stunned to see someone of their same age group and skin color working as a dishwasher, but I didn't see much reason for their shock. A few curious residents went out of their way to converse with me and get my story. I felt so different from them, like they were older, but I was the same age and from the same type of neighborhoods they were. I saw how they lived, and it felt like they were more deserving, like I was lucky to clean their plates. I worked at the dorm for 4 months and got to know the area. I didn't have to be at work until noon, so I spent my mornings hanging around the drag, writing poetry, and drinking coffee. I met interesting people, and every day was sprightly. I should have continued working there for the rest of the semester, but I didn't have a lick of sense back then. One day I got home from work and saw all my furniture and possessions sitting on the grass in Peter's front yard. Apparently, he lost it when he found out that I'd eaten the last slice of his Chicago-style deep dish pizza. That single slice of pizza was the only thing I ate of his the whole time I lived there. He'd specifically told me not to touch his food, but I couldn't resist. The box had a bright green dinosaur on it. I just smoked a bunch of pot, and when I cracked it open to take a peek, the pie smelled like it came straight from an Italian pizzeria in Chicago. Peter wouldn't let me back in, so I walked to a payphone and called my sister. She told me she didn't want me living with her, so I called Benny in San Antonio. Benny was always looking for an excuse to drive to Austin, so he said he'd pick me up at a coffee shop the next day. I didn't have anywhere to sleep, so I spent most of the night in Dobie Mall sitting on the tables outside the movie theater. I sat at the tables and stared out the second-story window onto the drag until a security guard told me to leave. From there, I walked aimlessly around Hyde Park and West Campus. The only other people I saw walking around that late were drag rats, drug addicts, and dateless prostitutes. The next morning, I called Benny from a payphone. He said he was running late and wouldn't get to Austin until evening. So I walked about a mile to Shoal Creek, climbed up some limestone cliffs, and found a shaded spot behind some bamboo to take a quick nap. I woke up a few hours later to light rain falling on my face. I don't know where I was or how I got there. I sat up and it started raining a little harder. I felt like I was at peace with myself and the world, like I could survive anything. But then, a wave of nervous energy hit me when I realized Benny was waiting for me at a coffee shop on the drag. Shit, 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 I yelled while I put my shoes back on. This was before cell phones, so even if Benny was in town, I couldn't call him. I had told him to meet me at Quack's coffee shop across from campus, but that was hours ago, so I ran back to UT in a panic, almost slipping on the recent puddles of rain. When I finally made it to the drag, I spotted Benny sitting on the outside patio of Quack's and breathed a sigh of relief. What took you so long? I've been in here for 2 hours, he yelled. I sat down, smiled, and shouted, Benny! He asked if I was stoned. I told him I wasn't, so we immediately went back to the creek I'd just come from and smoked a few bowls. By the time we got there, it stopped raining, and I showed him where I slept earlier in the day. He suggested that I just live at the creek. But I told him I'd rather go back to San Antonio and check on my truck. Okay, but don't go complaining to me in 2 weeks when you want to go back to San Antonio, he told me. I won't, I said. I'll have my truck fixed and I'll drive myself. I should have listened to Benny. Before we left, we drove back to Peter's and salvaged what we could of my possessions from his front yard. The rain had damaged most of my things, and we couldn't fit any furniture into Benny's 1989 Cavalier, but I grabbed what I could and we headed south 60 miles on I-35. For the next couple months, I'd either sneak inside Benny's window or I'd sleep in Mom's backyard and avoid Guy. Benny got me a gig at Red Lobster he worked at, but I couldn't make enough to fix my truck. When spring came, Guy had enough with me camping in their backyard, and my truck busted in front of their house, so he offered me a deal. He said he'd fix my truck if I left his house and never came back. Mom didn't like the idea, but I felt like I'd won the lottery. It cost plenty, but Guy stuck by our agreement. They rebuilt the transmission, put in a new radiator, carburetor, and replaced the old block with a new 350 V8 engine. It took a month for them to do it, but I'd never been more excited than the day I went to pick it up. For the first time in life, I had a huge mechanical horse to hit the trail with. My first drive was to Benny's hood to show my friends. When I got there, Benny and his friend Robert were on a porch hitting a 5-foot bong. I didn't completely stop, but I slowed down so that they could see me and gently tapped my horn, letting them catch up and jump in the back. Then I hit the gas and we spent the rest of the night tearing up the hood, hopping over curbs and plowing through neatly manicured yards. By sunrise, we were taking turns doing donuts with my truck in an empty strip mall. It was there we started talking about going on a road trip. I figured it'd be a good test for my truck. I had promised Guy that I'd disappear from Mom's house too, but I didn't know where I was going to go, and I figured a road trip would give me time to think. Michael wanted to go to Colorado, I wanted to go to California, and Benny and Robert wanted to leave Texas.